Hello, hello. Welcome to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Rose Seiler, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Paul Jones will be speaking about ghosts of predator past, spirits of perseverance present, and shadows of a fragile future, the pronghorn. I first asked Paul about doing a presentation for our speaker series over a year ago, so I'm really glad that it's finally worked out. Before we begin, I'd like to state that we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I'd like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. And just a few items before we get going. I'd like to note that PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series is a monthly presentation about anything to do with Native Prairie conservation or species at risk. On April 4th, we'll be having a presentation about the recovery of trumpeter swans in Alberta. And I'd like to invite everyone to join us on April 30th for a webinar about scale-dependent relationships between habitat, insects, and birds in native grasslands, jointly presented by Canadian Wildlife Federation, SODCAP, and Birds Canada. And you can register for these webinars on the PCAP website. And a reminder to our listeners out there, you'll be muted for the duration of the webinar, but if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type it into the Q&A section of the webinar dashboard at any time during the presentation. And feel free to upvote other people's questions if you have the same one. I'd like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our presenting sponsors, Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association, North American Helium, Nutrien, Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, and SaskTel. And I'm honored today to be able to introduce today's presenter. Paul Jones is a senior biologist with the Alberta Conservation Association, a not-for-profit, non-government registered charity largely funded by Alberta's hunters and anglers through license levies and a growing number of corporate partners. He has been with the ACA for 25 years, of which the last 20 years or so he studied pronghorn. He was the lead author on a book chapter on pronghorn. Oops, sorry.
Mhm.
He has authored or co-authored 27 peer-reviewed publications, of which most are on pronghorn. He was the lead author on a book chapter on pronghorn, has co-authored 2 additional book chapters, and presented numerous times at conferences, workshops, and to the general public promoting the conservation of pronghorn. Paul was also a co-author on the latest version of the North American Pronghorn Management Guides and the Pronghorn Bibliography that were published by the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. In 2016, Paul received 2 special recognition awards at the biennial Pronghorn Workshop for his efforts to conserve pronghorn. And last year, Paul was awarded the Prairie Conservationist Award for Alberta at the 13th Prairie Conservation Endangered Species Conference for his work on pronghorn and the multi-SAR program. He has a Bachelor's of Science degree from the University of Lethbridge and a Master's of Science degree from the University of Alberta. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Caitlin. And then is my slideshow up now? It
Yes,
looks like it is.
perfect.
Okay, perfect. So, yes, I think everyone should thank Caitlin. As she mentioned, it was like over a year ago that she tried to convince me to come and give a presentation to this group, and I sort of agreed. And then over the years, she would email me saying, "Are you still willing to come present?" And I would say, "Yeah." But really, it's a year ago when we first talked, and I started thinking about what would I present to the group that would sort of be kind of unique. And I did know that Dr. Andrew Jakes had presented on some of our research findings in the past on pronghorn. And I kind of settled on, just giving this story about what the pronghorn is. And this past summer, I was in Yellowstone and I bought a print of a pronghorn, and it was from a Native American artist. And she simply called it pronghorn, but she gave it a unique description. She called it, "Sometimes his story is tragic and sometimes his story is heroic." And really, that is very fitting for the pronghorn. And it's a mouth, the title is kind of a really tricky to say, but it's really what it is 3 presentations in one. So I'm going to talk at first about the ghosts of predator past, the historical history of the pronghorn and the archaeological records. Then I'm kind of going to transfer into sort of the spirits of the present, and then sort of talk about European settlement of North America, and then kind of quickly jump ahead to some of the work that I've been doing with pronghorn. and then kind of wrap up the presentation talking about, the fragile future. What does the future actually hold for pronghorn in North America? So the ancestral record of the pronghorn was first recorded during the Miocene epoch, about 8.8 to 18.5 million years ago. And it's from the subfamily Merocondantinae, or the pronghornlets. And you can sort of see it here. This is sort of the modern pronghorn and then a pronghornlet. And they stood about 20 inches, or about half the size of a modern day pronghorn. And they only weighed 26 to 24 pounds, and only males had horns. And they went extinct at the end of the Miocene. And then came Antilocapra, or the pronghorn books, about 14 million years ago, but they became more prominent in the archaeological record about 7 million years ago. And there was really two main genuses, Sphenophalus, which was in the record about 14 to 4 million years ago. They were smaller to the modern pronghorn, and they also had sort of forked horns, or even twisted horns, like the ones that you see over in Africa. And then the second genus was Taxama, and they were about 4 million years ago, but really became prominent about 1,000 years ago. And they had 4 horns, as you can sort of see here. You got sort of the front pair of horns, and then these smaller back horns. And they also went extinct just at the beginning of the Pleistocene. And that's when sort of the modern pronghorn, Antilocapra, came onto the record. It was about 1,000 years ago, 1 million years ago. And then they believe there's 2 species, Antelope americana and Antilocapra pacificus. And then only americana is still present in North America. The rest went extinct. So about the last ice age, only pronghorn Antilocapra survived. All of the other sort of species had gone extinct. And it sort of begs the question of why this particular species was able to survive when the others didn't. And some of the authors believe it's because of their adaptability. They were able to adjust to the changes in climate that was coming with that last ice age. And they also were able to adjust their diet seasonally from grazing to browsing. So basically, Antilocapra was able to survive because of its diet plasticity. But with it, it also kind of evolved special traits, which the modern pronghorn now has. And there was a unique study done by McKinnon and Walker in 1974 that did a comparison between the pronghorn and a domestic goat, which isn't a fast runner, but they're basically the same size. And they found that pronghorn had a heart that was twice as large for its body size. The blood had 50% more blood and also 60% more hemoglobin, plus 33% more red blood cells. The airway is half the resistance. And basically, they kind of say the windpipe is almost the size of a vacuum cleaner hose. And these are all important characteristics because it allows pronghorn to deliver oxygenated blood throughout its muscles. And it's one of the reasons why it can run so fast. It can actually reach up to 100 kilometers an hour when it runs full out. They also have these long, skinny legs. That the lower limbs are about 9 inches in length, and the bones are about the size of your index finger. And these bones also help generate speed when it's running. So as you can see here, increased heart, increased lung capacity, and increased airflow helps it run as fast as it is. And the reason it can run so fast is because in historic times, there was a North American cheetah. So the pronghorn is really adapted to avoiding cheetahs that were on the grasslands of North America that went extinct during the last ice age. And as a colleague, Dr. Byers, calls it, they're basically ghosts of predator past, and he has it right. They're adapted to predators that were on the landscape in North America that are no longer here. And basically, a pronghorn now can outrun any predator that's found in North America. Now I'm going to kind of transition into the spirits of perseverance present. So talk about European settle of North America, and then kind of jump ahead in the timescape to the 2000s when I started working with pronghorn. And again, this is sort of to highlight how pronghorn appears to persevered on a changing landscape. Just out of curiosity, this picture here was taken from the Jarrah Branch in southern Alberta. So the story of North America really starts with European settlement of the West, right? That's what people think about. And they relate it to the near extinction of bison. But sort of what's forgotten, or what sort of ends up in the distance, in the background sort of thing, is the story of the pronghorn. So bison numbered between 30 to 60 million at one time, and they were nearly extirpated between 1880 and 1885. The bison population estimates in 2010 range from 400,000 to 500,000, with only approximately 20,500 animals and 62 conservation herds that remain in approximately 64,000. The rest are in sort of commercial herds. And according to the IUCN, roughly only 15,000 would be considered free roaming. So yes, we were able to stop bison from going extinct in North America, but for the most part, they're not free ranging. Sort of pronghorn historic numbers were also said to be equal to or greater than the historic bison numbers. And again, pronghorn were nearly extirpated in 1900 and 1950, 1915. But what sort of the difference is we were able to bring pronghorn basically back from extinction, and they are free roaming. They're not confined by fences or agricultural practices. So really their conservation of the pronghorn should come to the forefront as one of our great success stories. So like the bison, pronghorn almost became extinct because of unregulated harvest. As the bison numbers disappeared, hunters switched to pronghorn. There was the breaking of native prairie by the sod busters, converting prairie to cropland, as well as there was a fencing of the prairies to control domestic livestock. And pronghorn didn't fare well with this fencing because they'd never encountered it before. And later on, I'll talk about the effects of fences on pronghorn. And then there was also the direct competition with domestic sheep for forage. There was about, at one time, 40 million sheep in the 11 Western states. And this is sort of where the conservation story really starts. And I'll just sort of focus on sort of Alberta and Saskatchewan. But back in the 1909, 1910s, the Alberta provincial government authorized the capture of pronghorn for Banff National Park and Wainwright Buffalo Park as a means of trying to regenerate populations in Alberta. And then the federal government's national park established in Alberta and Saskatchewan national parks. In 1914 in Alberta, it was a Waskanista National Park, and in 1915, Nemuscam National Park. And in Saskatchewan, there was a national park established southeast of Maple Creek and one east of the Old Wives Lake. And these were basically refugia for pronghorn and as source populations for reintroductions. And they were also different from the other national parks, like Banff National Park, whose mandate was actually tourism. These parks in Alberta and Saskatchewan were solely established for population reintroductions to keep pronghorn populations on the landscape. And then also, in addition, there was in 1920, the Alberta government gave a permit to C.J. Blazer to establish a pronghorn farm near Lake Newell. And I read one of the stories that some of the animals that he was raising were actually shipped down to Texas for reintroductions down there. The only thing is that I could never find out whether they actually successfully made it on the train or not. And then by 1947, when populations started to increase, all of these parks and reserves were closed. So kind of give you an idea in terms of the North American pronghorn population. We sort of start out almost near extinction in the late 1880s, early 1990s. By 1924, the North American population had increased to roughly 30,000. That's over a 100% increase from the 32,000 to over 386,000 by 1968. And then you see sort of these little dips in populations dropping down, going back up. But in 1984, the population hit just over 1 million animals. And again, these are all free-ranging animals on the landscape where they came from. And then again, we see this big decline in 1995 to 670,000 animals. This was associated with severe winters and major die-offs. And then in 2006, 2007, we hit sort of this all-time high of just over 1.1 million pronghorn. So now I'm kind of just sort of moved to spirits of perseverance present. And if I had to sum it up in 2 images to sort of talk about the work that I've been doing, these would be them. So this first one here, that's my a movement path for one of our pronghorns that was collared back in 2003, and I'll tell you her story. And the second is this image here that was captured by our NECA company when they were putting collars on pronghorn. And it really left a lasting image for me in my work with pronghorn. So we began our study in Alberta in 2003, and it was supposed to be just a sort of a 4-year study going between 2003 and 2007. What we did was we were sort of capturing pronghorn in 3 different study areas, moving from sort of the Montana border north in the province every year, capturing animals and putting collars on, and the collars would be on individuals for just under a year, 52 weeks to 54 weeks. And this was a joint project started between Alberta Conservation Association, the University of Calgary, and Alberta Fish and Wildlife. But then after basically the first year of the study and realizing how much these animals are moving and how interconnected populations are, the study expanded and also included Saskatchewan environment and resource management, as well as Montana fish, wildlife, and parks. And it became basically the study that went from 2003 to 2011. So here's that one special doe, that movement path that I showed you, and she's known as P3. She was one of the first captures we did. She was actually captured in December 2003 down here, sort of to the west of 1-4 near the Montana border. And then just shortly after that, she moved and basically spent the rest of that winter in this area here near Manyberries. And then come the following March of 2004, we basically lost track of her. She just sort of totally disappeared off the landscape, and this is why. She starts her migration north, and this is the path she takes. And then she hits sort of the end of March, she hits the Trans-Canada Highway to the east of Medicine Hat. And she actually spends 3 days here, going basically back and forth along the fence line before she's able to get across the Trans-Canada Highway. And then she continues her migration north. She actually goes up, does a stop in Saskatchewan, decides to come back, and then basically this is the fawning period in May here in Alberta. So basically she did 445 kilometers in the 3-week period. And then we're not sure if she actually lost her fawns or what happened, but then she basically moved back into Saskatchewan and spent the summer in Saskatchewan. And then came the fall, and she does this south migration, south again, and where she actually dropped her collar on CFB Suffield. So within the 52 weeks that her collar was on her, she traveled over 824 kilometers. And during this trip, she did 13 major highway crosses and 3 major river crossings. And really, we have no idea how many fence crossings she did when she did that. But it's basically her story is what sort of led to the idea that, Alberta pronghorn are connected to Saskatchewan pronghorn. And then we did have another animal that moved south into Montana. So Alberta pronghorn are also connected to Montana pronghorn. And then we found out too that Saskatchewan pronghorn are also connected to Montana pronghorn and Alberta pronghorn. So it's one sort of large mega population that are all interconnected. So this is sort of the new study here, and I just kind of want to orientate people to our study. This is what we call the Northern Sagebrush Steppes. So we have here this big red line, that's the Trans-Canada Highway, going from sort of Brooks here through Medicine Hat to Swift Current to Regina. We have Lethbridge here and Highway 3 that goes to Medicine Hat. And then on the south side in Montana, we have Shelby. And this is the Highway 2 that runs east-west through Havre, Malter, and Glasgow. And the yellowish sort of lime green area, that's our native prairie that's remaining. And then the green areas are cropland and agriculture. And then this map will sort of be the foundation for a number of different maps. And I'm going to show you some of the movement patterns that these animals do. And then just also to orientate people, these are the PFRA pastures and then Grasslands National Park here along the border. So one of the major outcomes of the original study that we did was connectivity. And this is the work of Dr. Andrew Jakes, who at the time was a PhD student at the University of Calgary and is someone that I still work with today on pronghorn. And this map is sort of the same kind of map, except it just shows Alberta, Saskatchewan. And basically he took the GPS collar data, did sort of a resource select function of what habitat they were using during the fall and spring migrations, and then was able to produce this connectivity map. And it really highlights how animals are potentially crossing Highway 3, moving north and south. So that's what sort of these blue areas, they're the connectivity pathways. And it shows sort of the connectivity from sort of central Alberta, CFB Suffield area across Highway 1 to southern Alberta. Then on the Saskatchewan side, how animals can move sort of east-west between Alberta and Saskatchewan, and then again north-south from crossing the Trans-Canada Highway into more southern Saskatchewan. And then you can kind of cut off here, but this is animals that can then move from Saskatchewan into Montana. So it really highlights the number of connectivity pathways that animals can use when they want to move. But one of the things that this map doesn't really show is the individuality, the pathways that individuals are moving. I really found this very interesting. So I put together these maps that sort of show the connectivity, the pathways that the individuals moved. And I tried to color code each animal is a unique color, but ArcGIS only has so many colors, so some of them look really similar. So this is our Alberta animals. These were the ones that were captured in December of 2003 and the following spring, 2004. So it really began sort of spring migrations begin in sort of end of March, mid to end of March, and they move sort of a north-south basis. And here again, this is our big mover P3 the story that I shared earlier. And you can see animals moving from the southern Alberta north into Suffield and then even further. And then, as with everything, there's always one exception to the rule. And we have this animal here who decided in the spring to do a south migration, cut across into Saskatchewan through the PFRA pastures and down to Chinook, Montana, where she actually, we're not sure what happened to her, if she died or if her collar just dropped. But we eventually got the collar back from a landowner that showed this migration. So that's sort of, you can see the individuality starting to pop out in terms of the routes that these animals make. And then again, spring of 2005. So this was animals that were captured in March of 2005 and then started migrating at the end of March, early April. And you can see most of them were captured actually north of highway, the Trans-Canada, and then they did these big migrations up into more central Alberta and then also into Saskatchewan. And then this is our third year of animals captured early March 2006 and then began end of March migrating and again moving off of the Suffield area and going sort of north and east and northwest into Saskatchewan and then into sort of the Brooks area in Alberta, Brooks and Drumheller. So you can sort of see these patterns and each individual is almost going in its own direction in its own way. Oh, sorry, I'll go back. So then we captured animals in 2008. These were captured in Montana. And then in the spring again, started moving north. And again, you can sort of see more animals were captured. And then again, springtime migrations, spring of 2009, you can see how many animals are moving sort of more north and how much connected Saskatchewan and Montana really are in terms of pronghorn movement. And then lastly, this is the spring of 2010. Again, animals moving sort of north-south, north in from sort of the Malta area, Glasgow area up into Saskatchewan. So for the most part, spring migrations start sort of mid to end of March. They last anywhere from 15 to 29 days. And on average, they kind of range from just over 100 kilometers to 253, with again, that 445 being the longest migration. Now, one of the things you can sort of take from that is, you'll see it in a little bit here, but animals in Montana sort of being always north of Highway 2. And then we're going to transition now into fall migrations. So fall migrations sort of start end of October, early November. And the interesting thing about every year that animals were collared in Alberta, so from 2004 to 2006, all of those animals made the south migrations, but all of them stopped on CFB Suffield and dropped their collars there during the wintertime. The exception was this animal here that did a little bit of a south move, but the rest all stayed north of the Trans-Canada Highway. And then again, we start transitioning to animals that were collared in Saskatchewan and Montana. Again, the south migration starting in the fall as well, November, as usual when these animals moved. And again, you can see they're moving south, but hitting Highway 2. And here's some more animals moving south, again, from sort of the Saskatchewan area and sort of northern Montana down to that Highway 2 area to winter. And then this is sort of the last year of our fall collars. And we have this one long animal that is the migration south to, again, that Highway 2 area in Montana. And for these animals, they're moving anywhere from, the lowest was 60-kilometer migration all the way up to over 200 kilometers during the fall period. And they actually are a little bit shorter days. Some of these animals are doing these migrations within 5 days, and the max we had was 22 days. And then we have what we call these facultative migrations. So basically, facultative migrations are when they've already basically happens in the wintertime. So they've already done a fall migration usually, or sometimes they're resident animals that were on, basically these animals are on their winter range. And then the conditions become so harsh that they do these long movements, these long migrations. So this is the first one that we sort of see in 2008, 2009. So these are animals that were on a winter range and then decide to move. And this was the first time we actually recorded animals being able to cross that Highway 2 in Montana. And then we have the 2009, 2010 winter, where again, we start to see animals moving south again. And just to orientate people, the red arrows were animals that were migratory, so they'd already done a fall migration. And it's one of the first times where we see a resident animal that was sort of, they spend the summer and winters on the same range, making a long distance movement during the winter to escape harsh conditions. And again, we start to see animals crossing Highway 2 in Montana. And then this is the winter of 2010, 2011. And this was one of the most severe winters on record. I think they said it was like a 1 in 100 year winter event in Montana. And we basically had most of our animals making these facultative migrations. So going from what would be traditionally the winter ranger and then heading south to avoid conditions. And I know I said, you can sort of see here, we had actually animals that were leaving our study area, heading south as best they could, crossing Highway 2 and continuing south, trying to find more conditions that are conducive to survival. And then I know I sort of mentioned that, you know, migrants were red and residents were blue, and then you can sort of say, well, he's got these different colors. Well, these 4 animals were very unique in terms of they did a movement, facultative movement, and then they stayed in an area for, one was about a week, the others were up to almost a month apart. And then they did actually a second facultative migration. So you can sort of see here, this animal moved this distance here, spent about a week or 2 in this area, and then still couldn't make a living, decided to do another movement, and then did this movement. And you can sort of see here, this animal moved south here, and then moved again, heading south. And just some ideas is some of these animals were moving at the beginning during that first facultative migration, moving anywhere from 50 kilometers to over 200 kilometers, waiting for a while, likely trying to recoup energy and then having to move again. And then those second migrations ranged anywhere from 67 kilometers to over 159 kilometers. So it sort of talks to the individual pronghorns trying to persevere in this landscape and adjust to the changing winter conditions. And this is just some of the examples of the images that we collected during that severe winter of 2010, 2011. You can sort of see long groups here on the sort of hilltops looking for forage, these big groups migrating south. This is some of the outcomes that we found is major mortality that year. I think it was like 60% of Montana's pronghorn in the north, they believe, perished during that winter. And you can sort of see here, this is a picture from the Billings Gazette of a pronghorn, basically in a snowbank, and it's up over its shoulders, and all you can sort of see its head. So you can sort of see trying to walk or move in that would be very exhausting. And that's why we've had major mortalities. And we also had some unique events. Andrew recorded a group of 200 pronghorn, including one of the collar animals, being hit on the railway tracks and killing all of the animals. So I just kind of want to jump back to this map now that I'm sort of showing you the individual pathways and how some of the barriers showed up. Oh no. Can you still see my screen, or did we just lose everything?
We can still see your screen. It looks like it says element not valid.
Yeah, not sure what that is. Okay, we're back now. Looks like.
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
that looks good.
Little hiccup. I don't know what that was. So okay.
I don't know either.
So one of the things I want people to think about is when they look at that, we we actually had, it shows migration corridors or connectivity north-south in Saskatchewan. But one of the things is we never actually had animals collared north of the Trans-Canada Highway. And all we did have, we had a few animals that would move north, but hit the Trans-Canada and never cross. And then on the Alberta side, we had those spring migrations that first year that crossed the Trans-Canada Highway, but none of the other animals ever crossed. And all of the fall migrations ended on Suffield. So while we can sort of map connectivity, I think we have to think of this map as structural connectivity, right? So basically the physical relationship between habitat patches. But what we need to start asking ourselves is this functional connectivity, right? To what degree is this landscape actually facilitate or impedes movement of pronghorn across the landscape? And I'll come back to that in a little bit as well. And then now I'm going to kind of transfer to this image, that second image from our original study. And basically when we've seen this, we started questioning what is happening with this animal? What is all of this hair loss and scarring and black tissue really from? And basically what we kind of came up with is it's from fences. It's from this animal crossing multiple times under fences and having the hair removed. And then it's likely because of a cold winter with these patches of hair loss that the animal was exposed to the elements and frostbite set in. And that's what this sort of black leathery skin looks like. And it kind of really got us questioning how much of an impact fences are for pronghorn, not only for their movement, but also for their health. And the fences, they're commonplace across North America, and they play an important role for society, right? They mark our property boundaries. They control domestic livestock distribution. They also protect us from collisions with wildlife as well as livestock that may stray onto the roads and highways. But again, we have to start thinking about what are the impacts of fences. And we published this very sort of monumental paper called "The Fence Runs Through It." And basically what it was is kind of a paper calling the attention of the conservation community to start thinking about what are the impacts of fences on wildlife and ecosystems. And since that paper has been published, there's been a number of articles now that are looking specifically at different animals, ranging from the size of a frog all the way up to, ungulates in Africa and the potential impacts fences are having on them. And just to kind of give you an idea, we did a mapping exercise of fence lines in Alberta, and we mapped 630 townships in kind of the core area of pronghorn range up sort of that east side of the province. And on average, there was 106 kilometers of fence lines per township. And just to kind of put it in perspective, and why I put this image of the globe on, or the world on there, is that basically we have enough fences in Alberta to go around the earth 1.6 times. Basically, the circumference of the earth is 40,000 kilometers, and we have 1.6 times that in fences on just Alberta alone. And if you think about it, most likely all of the fences in Alberta are 4 strands. So if you were to actually take all of that wire and put it end to end, we'd actually be able to go around the earth 6.4 times. So from a pronghorn perspective, is fences are part of daily life. They're interacting with fences every single day. And just to kind of give you an idea, so we took, this is for the whole northern sagebrush steppe, and taking some of the fence data that we have for that. And we worked with the Mistakis Institute and used a package called BABA in R that sort of classifies the fence behavioral interactions. And really there's 3 sort of major categories: normal movement, altered movement, and trap movement. And from that analysis, we were able to determine that basically 30% of all of our animals' movements are in this altered behavior, and that 2% are in the trap behavior. But one of the caveats I always say with that analysis is that our collars, for the most part, were taking locations every 4 hours, which is fairly coarse scale. So really, we don't know how many of these normal interactions were actually be classified as altered if we had more fine resolution, let's say every hour locations, right? So how many times over that 4-hour period, maybe out of that 2 hours, an animal actually was paralleling a fence before it was able to cross? And that these numbers are likely skewed low compared to what a pronghorn really faces on the landscape. And then this is a video I always show. I'm just going to hit pause and just kind of explain it. So this is kind of, it's pretty self-explanatory, but I just kind of want people to focus on how these animals cross this fence, and then in particular pay across Pay attention to the last animal that crosses. Oh. Right nervous behavior. It can't cross the first time it wants to. So you can sort of see, the young animal, the fawn, had a hard time crossing, even though this wire, I believe, is at 20 inches above the ground. It still delayed its movement. And then that last animal, it got nervous and come flying through. And you can sort of see how much hair it actually lost. And that's just from one crossing of a fence. Now, can you imagine doing that 100 times or 1,000 times a day? And that's why you sort of see, that first image of all that hair loss in the black skin, why that sort of happens. And then that sort of led to sort of another phase of the pronghorn work that I was doing was looking for solutions to make fences sort of more wildlife friendly, or as we like to say, wildlife friendlier. When I started this work, there was a number of proposed solutions. The major one was the goat bar, which is sort of a white PVC pipe that connects the top two wires and creates a bigger opening under the bottom wire for pronghorn to crawl under. And then also encases the barbed wire in the PVC pipe, which then gives some protection to the animal's backs. And then I came up with, well, maybe we don't use a PVC pipe, but we can use something a little bit quicker and a little easier. And these carabiners or quick links to do sort of the same idea, except you do lose the effect of the barbed wire. And then again, double-stranded smooth wire on the bottom, and then open gates. But one of the things is there was very actually little studies that showed whether these were effective or not. And that's sort of the work that we started is testing these out and seeing how pronghorn, and then eventually transitioned to, as well as deer, reacted to these fence modifications. And then sort of the major highlights of the work is we kind of came up with this golden standard, this 18 inches. You can see how quickly it changes as you move up the bottom wire height to 18 inches and the number of vents. And the black bars are a number of successes and number of attempts. So you can sort of see from this is pronghorn were really looking for areas along the fence where it was already naturally high, but it had to be at least 18 inches to be able to cross. And then that's now sort of become the gold standard across North America. When you start talking wildlife friendly fencing, is everyone's putting the standard as a minimum of a bottom wire height of 18 inches. And then the other thing we really found is spatial memory. These pronghorn know where along a fence they can actually crawl under, and they'll travel along a fence to get to these spots. And we found this out sort of the hard way as we used sort of this complete randomization design when we first started this work. And we had pronghorn walking past our enhancements where they could easily cross to go to the next fence section down where they were crossing at these known sites. So it's really talked to their ability to memorize the landscape and know where to cross. And then sort of just a high level where we sort of came up with sort of the $1 million question is what recommendations will actually work for pronghorn. And most of these will also work for deer. And this is sort of how I rank things out is, if you can protect or even enhance these known fence crossings, that's sort of like the gold standard at the top of the pyramid. And then smooth wire on the bottom at 18 inches, because you get that added benefit of the barbs not being on there. So it reduces the chance of hair loss, followed by clips. And that's more because they're cheaper and quicker, but they do have the barbed wire still that can remove hair and cause injuries. And then lastly, in red, we have goat bars. And what we found is these white PVC pipes, which you can sort of see here, had this sort of adverse effect on the behavior of pronghorn. Most of our images of pronghorn crossing at these sites, the animals actually didn't go underneath the white PVC pipe for some reason. So they lost that benefit. What they would do is they would cross here at the ends of the PVC pipe where the wire was still pinched together a little bit and there was a bit of an opening. So from our studies, we've sort of said, don't necessarily use goat bars as they're not as effective as one would think. So now sort of transitioning into the last part of my talk, sort of the shadows of the fragile future and sort of moving forward from sort of today's world into the future and what it might hold for pronghorn. We've already sort of shown that, pronghorn were adaptable, they survived the Ice Age. They're able to adapt to the changing landscape during European settlement and in today's world as well. But really what holds for North American pronghorn moving forward? So for pronghorn, we know that, the populations tend to be partially migratory and do what we call surfing the green waves. So in the springtime, they're looking for that very green, nutritious forage. And it's very important for their diet and for replenishing fats lost during the wintertime. So they need to be able to move to track these resources. And then if you think about all of the fall migrations, trying to avoid winter conditions, get to better winter ranges on those facultative movements. We also know that they sort of surf the white wave, but in this time, what they're trying to do is get ahead of those major winter storms and winter conditions that are unconducive to survival. They're looking for areas where the sagebrush is abundant and is also above the snow so that they can continue to forage. But what's going to happen if global warming does exist and is a reality, and we start after thinking about pronghorn and surfing the heat wave, right? How are they going to deal with these hotter temperatures and potentially extended drought conditions? And I just want to highlight sort of 3 studies that have started to look at that in some ways. So this is a neat map from Bean et al. In 2023, and it sort of shows the difference between the pronghorn across the North American range, where we have sort of this sort of 2 subpopulations, the animals that deal with the heat conditions of the south, and then our animals more the north central area that deal with more of the cold conditions. And I just kind of want to point out, so animals here in Texas that are more dealing with heat conditions, they're already sort of showing declines in population. There's been major translocations where animals from the Trans-Pecos region have been moved to the south. And so far they've moved 775 pronghorn from the Panhandle to the Trans-Pecos region. And that's because in the 1980s, they had a population of around 14,000 animals. By 2011, it was down to 2,700 animals. And then again, they were dealing with drought conditions in Texas and the heating. With those translocations, they have actually been able to recover some of the population, and now it sits at 4,500. And then we have a study by Zeller et al. In the Great Basin region of Nevada, Oregon, Idaho, and Utah, who was sort of looking at global climate change and what the impacts may be for pronghorn in this area. And then her and her team were able to conclude that under 2 different climate changes, so one was plus 2 degrees Celsius increase during the year, or plus 4, that there would be a decrease in quality habitat as well as a loss of connectivity. And then sort of the last study, which is just recently been published by Dr. Donovan et al., looked at fawn recruitment, fawn productivity in Wyoming. And Wyoming is basically the heart of pronghorn populations in North America. It's usually over half of the North American population can be found in Wyoming. And they were looking at a number of different factors, but what they found since the 1980s is pronghorn have been experiencing the decreases in fawn productivity in this area. And they've been attributing that to sort of oil and gas development as well as tree encroachment into the sagebrush habitat. So it's that's an alarm bell. If the area that sort of has half North Americans' populations are seeing decreases in productivity, what does it mean for the rest of the area? So I kind of want to just bring up this map again one last time, our connectivity map, but this time I want to point out the color codes and sort of explain what these are in the map, because I'm sure some of you have been thinking about that. So ICA has been working with Moustakis Institute out of Calgary to develop a plan to maintain connectivity for pronghorn in Alberta through the Pronghorn Crossing Program. And basically we use citizen science data, animal vehicle collision data, as well as Andrew Jake's connectivity model here to sort of identify areas along the Trans-Canada Highway between Brooks and Swift Current that may be conducive to having a structure built to keep connectivity, and that's what these are. So the blue ones are sort of a low priority, the red ones are a high priority. And as you can sort of see, there's roughly 8 in Alberta and 8 in Saskatchewan, of where maybe a road mitigation system could be put into place to maintain connectivity for pronghorn and make it easier for animals to move north and south. Unlikely what we're looking at is an overpass in Alberta. It's been found that pronghorn prefer to use overpasses as underpasses, which logically makes sense. I mean, a pronghorn's main predator defense is their eyesight and to be able to see predators at a long distance. So they prefer to go over these overpasses where you can see, and this is an example from Wyoming along the path of the pronghorn. In Saskatchewan, we're likely going to be looking at sort of maybe a wide span bridge as the road mitigation structure, just so that we can keep large farm equipment moving along the highway. But then again, this is all again based on the assumption that we have functional connectivity within both Alberta and Saskatchewan, which, we're really not sure if we actually do. So, I mean, that's one of the things we're proposing now is starting another collaring project and putting collars back on pronghorn north and south of the Trans-Canada Highway, hopefully in both Alberta and Saskatchewan, and just kind of assess, how much connectivity is going on, or have we lost it? Because really the big question we need to ask ourselves is are these animals in Alberta and Saskatchewan still partially migratory? I mean, our original study out of the 170 animals that we had, 49% were resident and 59% were migratory. But we got to ask ourselves, what happens if we start tipping the balance of the scale? And what would happen to our pronghorn populations if over time we lost that migratory component? They became 0% of the population and everyone became resident. What would be the outcomes for pronghorn? We have to ask ourselves, when we have these next major winter event, what's going to happen to those animals that are north of Highway 1 that can't cross the Trans-Canada to continue moving south to find better conditions? Are we looking at a major die-off of populations that are going to be really slow to recover? Or what happens if global warming does happen and we get more severe droughts and animals can't move around that landscape because of, the changes to it, the fences, the roads, the industrial development, renewable energy? Are we also going to start seeing, decreases in farm productivity and decreases in populations from malnutrition and predation in our populations as well? And with that, I'll sort of wrap up my presentation and take questions.
First of all, thank you so much, Paul. That was a fabulous presentation. Definitely worth the year's wait. um, we have quite a few questions already, and I know we're probably not going to make them through, but if anyone else has questions, feel free to type it into the Q&A section of the webinar dashboard. And if you have the same question as someone else, just upvote it, and it makes my job moderating a little bit easier. Okay, so I'm just going to start at the top, I guess.
Yep.
The first one is, how do pronghorn know which way is south and that the weather to the south will be warmer?
Really, I have no idea. I mean, I think part of it is tradition and learned behavior, the doe passing down to the fawns that in the spring we move north and in the winter we move south. But yeah, I mean, in terms of how they know to move, really, I have no idea. I mean, partly in the spring, the movement north would be following green up. So the areas start to green up. So they keep moving north to try to peak on that wave so they get the highest nutrition all of the time. And then in maybe it's in the fall, they know to move south because they've had survival in those areas over the winter time. But then again, as we've seen, just moving south doesn't mean it's going to be good for you that winter with those facultative migrations that I showed, is that you may move to an area that isn't hospitable for survival, and then that's when we see these facultative migrations.
Okay, that's very interesting. So the next one is from Jessica. Have we seen increased implementation of these wildlife fencing solutions following this research? Are there incentives for landowners to invest in and implement more wildlife-friendly fencing?
On the Alberta side, I would say yes. We've been working with Alberta Fish and Game Association. They have like this pronghorn migration fencing project where over the last 10 years or so, we've done over 400 kilometers or 500 kilometers of wildlife friendly fencing, working with the ranching community. So basically, AFGA and ACF secured funding to purchase all of the material, and then AFGA brings in their volunteer army, as we call it, of volunteers that come out, and they usually do about 3 fencing weekends over the summer into the fall, where they go out and they work with different landowners to replace that bottom wire and put up the double-stranded smooth wire, so it's sort of no cost to a landowner. And I think Saskatchewan's done a little bit of that work as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure. That would be good to know. But yeah, it's great that there's something in place already in Alberta. That's fantastic. The next question is about prion diseases like chronic wasting disease. Are pronghorns susceptible?
I wish I had the meme up that I have of that. So they've done studies within the lab setting that says, yes, pronghorn are susceptible to CWD disease, but it's never been documented in the wild
Mm,
about wild pronghorn actually having CWD. But partly is, and that's what this meme is about, is I don't think anyone's actually ever been looking for CWD in pronghorn, so it's hard to detect it if you don't look for it.
yeah, yeah, that's very interesting. You're right. And
Mhm.
Erica is wondering, why are the protected areas outside of the migration routes? Where were the pre-existing protected areas, the ones that you talked about earlier in your presentation, and did they overlap with connectivity migration routes?
I don't have a specific map of where they are, but partly why they don't overlap with migration routes is because we had no idea these animals are actually migrating. It's the new technology, these GPS collars that basically showed us how much these animals are moving. Like there were some studies in the early 60s where they had neck bands on pronghorn in Saskatchewan that showed up in Montana. So there was a notion that yes, animals were connected, animals were migrating, but no one knew exactly where or how these animals were moving across the landscape. So most of the parks were pre-established before migration routes were known. Now, the one case of is one of the early reserves that the national park established was likely on a migration route because how they actually got all of the pronghorn in there is they built fences up in the summertime, and then in the fall when animals moved into that area, then they closed the fences off and trapped the animals. So
Mm,
my guess is those were animals that were migrating that got into that area because they knew that's where they were going to go, and then got fenced off, and that's where sort of led to the sort of one of the reintroduction populations for that area.
okay, okay, that makes sense. Um, and then there's a question from Laura about an app. There was once an app to help track pronghorn movement in southwest of Saskatchewan, maybe Alberta. The app is no longer functioning, but the info I think was to figure out migrating patterns with the intent to help figure out where land bridges over Highway Number One would go. Is this state data still being used, or are you aware of it?
Yeah. So that's the project I was talking about with the Mustakis
Mhm.
Institute and Pronghorn Crossing. So that was the name of the app, was Pronghorn Crossing. So we did basically a data collection over 3 years using citizen science, the general public that would drive. Mostly, we just used it for the Trans Canada Highway that would report their observations of pronghorn, whether they were crossing the highway, dead on the highway, or sort of what we called staging, basically standing next to the highway, waiting to get across. And that's that data that we use that along with the animal vehicle collision data and Andrew's connectivity model to come up with those priority sites, those red and blue dots. And then, yeah, so there's no real data collection going on right now via the app. Like the person said, the app is sort of shut down. But we are continuing to work with our stakeholders, the Fish and Wildlife agencies in both Alberta and Saskatchewan, as well as the transportation departments, on sort of pushing forward with getting one of these mitigation structures built for both Alberta and Saskatchewan.
Okay. And we have lots of questions coming in about solar projects. Do you have any idea about the impact of solar projects on pronghorn migration?
Yes and no. So I think with a lot of species, if you're outside of sort of bats and raptors, there hasn't been a lot of studies on impacts of solar and wind energy on a number of different species, including pronghorn. So I'm only aware of one study that looked at a solar farm and its impact on pronghorn. And so not only when they put up that chain link fence around the panels, the solar panels, do you lose that habitat? But this study also found there's almost like a 40% buffer around that fence of habitat loss because animals tend to avoid that area. And they also found that it did affect their winter movements with animals having to move around. And at one point, all of the animals were getting funneled onto a road, and it was creating a major issue with vehicles and potential collisions that they eventually went back to the solar company and had them move their fence closer to the sonar panels so that animals had sort of a corridor between the fence and the road that they can move up and down on. And similar with wind energy, there's been sort of one major study in Wyoming that had 4 different students addressing questions, but it does too. They found I think it was in the fall or the spring, that animals that encountered the wind turbines would move faster when moving through that area. And then in the fall, it was kind of the opposite, where they would move sort of slower. But it's one of the things that we would like to look at too if we get this collar study up and running.
Absolutely. I think we have about 21 questions that have come in, and about 4 are regarding solar projects. So there's definitely interest there in knowing more about that impact.
Mhm.
Um, and another listener is wondering, have there been any genetic or DNA or biogenetic studies done to characterize the populations?
There's been a few more down in the south part of the range for the species or the subspecies that are endangered, kind of looking at inbreeding in that way. There hasn't been really a full range-wide assessment of pronghorn genetics, which would be really interesting to do, because over the years there's been a lot of translocations, like animals from Wyoming getting moved to Texas, animals from Wyoming getting moved into Mexico. So it would kind of be interesting to see what the genetics are of all of these populations.
Okay, that's great. Looks like another project for somebody.
Mhm.
um, and we have a few questions about fences. So the first one from Bill: why can't they jump a fence?
Well, technically, physically, they can jump a fence. And I actually have some images from our camera trap work when we were testing the modifications of pronghorn jumping fences. But what I think it is, it's kind of a combination of 2 things. One is behavior. They've never, when Europeans settlement started putting up fences, they never encountered it before, and everything on their landscape that they were used to is sort of low growing. So behaviorally, they decided that they were going to cross underneath the fence. And then I
Hmm.
think the other part is also physical, right? Remember I mentioned that the bones are like the size of your index finger, and those lower limbs. So I always kind of
Yeah.
make the point of is put on your wife's high heel stilettos and then try jump a fence and see how comfortable it is when you land on those shoes, how your feet feel. And I think the pronghorn are the same way, right? They have those very tiny bones that jumping over a 4-foot fence and landing on their small hooves and small bones isn't really conducive for them to jump.
That makes sense. Not that I wear stilettos often, but I couldn't imagine trying to jump anything while wearing them. But
Right.
there's something beautiful about seeing a pronghorn kind of scoot underneath there. Like it's fascinating. When I first moved out to the prairies, the first time I saw it, it was heartwarming almost. It's pretty neat.
Mhm.
Yeah. The next question is about what about electric fences? Do you have any recommendations about that? Should they have a ground wire in Canada?
Really, no one's really looked in depth in terms of pronghorn and electric
Mhm.
fences. We have a little bit of data that we're going to try to see if we can actually tease anything out, but we haven't really looked at it yet. So yeah, really, I can't comment on it.
Okay.
Other than the hair is fairly hollow, so I don't know if they would be going under if they would get a shock or not.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. One of the areas, that the best they have a student, a grad student look at in terms of electric fence and different species
Yeah.
reactions.
It would be interesting to see. Yeah.
Mhm.
And Brian is wondering about the bottom wire height data, 18 inches versus 19 inches. And he said it's very close. 19 inches seems to be an anomaly. Do you have any comments?
No, I think we just sort of settled on the 18 inches because we had 2 major study areas, one here in Alberta, one in Montana, and it kind of seemed to come out that was sort of the optimal height. We sort of had to pick one. But I mean, I've talked to landowners, and some have said 18 inches. Some have said, well, you can even go as high as 20 inches. So we
Mm.
kind of had to sort of settle on where to go, and we went with 18 inches because before our study, the minimum was suggested of being 14 inches was kind of what
Okay.
they recommended at the time. And then we've sort of said, well, no, we need to bump that up to 18 inches.
Okay. That makes
And
sense.
then with our results, we've also found that mule deer and whitetail will also go under a bottom wire if it's at 18 inches, if they're not scared or disturbed.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, and I know we're getting close to time, so I'm hoping is it okay if we stay on for a couple more questions?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
And then if people
perfect.
want, they can also
Thanks.
email me questions as well, and I'll get back to them as soon as I can.
Fantastic. And someone was wondering about if you have any ideas what caused the population decline in the 1980s.
I think some of it has to deal with severe winter weather. I
Hmm.
mean, that seems to be especially in the north part of the range so you get these severe winters and we get massive die-offs. And we see the cyclic pattern in Alberta and in Saskatchewan in terms of their populations. But then it speaks to we get these die-offs, but is it die-offs because of the winter conditions or because they can't escape the winter conditions, right? They aren't able to move.
Okay, that makes sense. And regarding migration, do you have any idea whether local versus migration for pronghorn was different when there was once large buffalo herds, when there was buffalo herds migrating? Is there any information available about that time period?
No, not really. But that's sort of if we get this new project going, one of the things we've talked about is looking for potentially a grad student to look at like Native American traditional knowledge and what they know about sort of migration of bison as well as pronghorn. It's
Okay.
kind of one of those things. So there's this group called the Global Initiative on Ungulate Migrations, when I attended their first meeting last summer. And one of the things that they talked about is we're starting to realize the migrations that we have and the ones that we're starting to lose, but how many different migrations have we lost over the past? And can we start filling in some of that data by looking at, traditional ecological knowledge?
Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting. And Eric is wondering, you'd mentioned the previous national parks and wildlife reserve areas. Do you know why they were closed and any thought of getting them reestablished for the conservation of species like pronghorn?
I think they ended up closing them because populations were starting to recover. So they
Mhm.
kind of served their point, their purpose, and then they just, eventually closed them. That's my guesses from what I can find. I can only really find dates of when they closed, no, sort of why they closed, but that's my guess is populations were recovering and they were sort of deemed unnecessary at the time.
Mhm.
For the most part, they've kind of established a few in Mexico, kind of reserves for, I believe it's Sonora and Pronghorn, where their populations have been super declined, and they're doing sort of reintroductions by bringing animals into those reserves and trying to raise them in captivity in a sense, and then releasing them back out to the wild. But for the most part, they're across North America. They usually more just translocations of capturing wild animals and then moving them to different parts of their range to reestablish them.
Okay. And do you know anything about coyote predation on pronghorn fawns?
Yes, the coyotes are one of sort of the major predators
Okay.
of coyote fawns, but the pronghorn are a unique species in terms of they invest quite a lot into reproduction. So they will have fawns basically every time. It's something like the North American averages is 1.9. And basically part of what this is predator swamping. So while they'll have twins, the likelihood of both twins surviving is sort of limited. And the major predators tend to be coyotes, golden eagles, and bobcats.
Okay. And then we have a comment here from Phil. Happy birthday, Paul, from the Lethbridge office. Is it your birthday today?
No, it's not today.
Okay.
No, it was
Soon though?
yesterday.
Yesterday?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's pretty awesome. And he says, go pronghorns.
Yeah, exactly. I've converted him.
Awesome. Well, I think that's all the time we have today for questions. We've had lots and lots of comments coming in. I'll just reiterate a few. Thanks very much for the excellent presentation. Amanda says, happy to see discussion on the potential for land crossings on Highway number 1. Um, uh, Al says, there's been so many great questions, and thank you so much for all this empirical data regarding this. So very interesting information and presentation. Um, Thank you and great presentation. This was awesome. Thanks, Paul. So we've had really like amazing comments coming in, and I just want to thank you for taking the time to present this really interesting research and hoping that we can all work together and help Pronghorn in the future. So thank you, Paul.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for your kind words.
And To all of our attendees, when you leave today's webinar, there'll be a quick 1-minute survey. If you don't mind filling it out, we really appreciate it because we can keep our Native Prairie speaker series going into the future. We've been recording today's webinar, so if you missed part of it or you know somebody who would love it, then we will have it up on the YouTube channel in the near future, and we'll be sure to share that on the PCAP e-newsletter and social media as well. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. And hopefully we'll see you on April 4th for a presentation about trumpeter swans. Okay, bye now.